Hello, and welcome to the Wednesday, December 13th special edition of Cluster Lifecycle for kubeadm HA and upgrades. Let's see, not sure. I checked the agenda and there was nothing in there. So hopefully the folks that have showed up have something to talk about. Otherwise, this will be a very short meeting.
I wanted to chat about the plans for self-hosting and to start to enumerate the issues around secrets and whether or not we are going to default to using host volume mounts or whether or not we should secret the secrets and then we have to checkpoint them, because this will affect work efforts in the next cycle.
Yeah, so as Tim said, we have two options. One, use host path mounts, which requires us to, in some way, wire our own rotation and basically some kind of system to manage them as we scale towards AJ and other, periodic rotation and making sure all masters, for example, have the same certificates at any given time, which is basically reinventing what Kubernetes is doing, right? So, but the other option, using secrets, has also drawbacks. For example, we have to use the deny authorizer feature that Mike Denise added in 1.9, but that requires us to have a custom webhook inside of the cluster to deny access to the secrets by anyone but root, which is system masters, that group. And also has to include support for bootstrapping checkpointing for secrets, so which is the other primary blocker for using it, or thing to discuss.
I don't think it's necessarily a blocker, other than it's a total opt-in feature. I think it's just getting people to just okay it is the hardest part, right? The code itself to actually make this happen is not hard. I think it's the political and security ramifications that people kind of hem and haw on that makes it difficult. I think this is the right way to go, is to force the checkpointing of secrets. I don't think we want to checkpoint anything else, though. That kind of gets into hairy territory that I don't want to own and maintain. I know that there was a third thing that the CoreOS folks checkpoint, which is config maps. But that gets into another weird space, which I don't want to get into, because then that's generic checkpointing almost to that stage once you start doing that.
But how about component config, which we'll start rolling out component config as soon as we get it.
Component config is
so. Let's consider just the control manager and scheduler for now. For example, I'd like the scheduler to roll over to component config in the next cycle, which I think is possible. They will graduate it to be the next cycle, from what I understand. And that has almost no drawbacks, from our configuration perspective. But so, it would then require config maps.
This is only a problem for the single master case, right? For the multi-master case, this is not a problem. We can always just say we will not do we will do a very limited user story for single node self-hosted, because otherwise we add all these complexities into the system. If we don't care, we can just say the larger HA configuration, we will provide config maps or component config throughout the entire chain. I know we want to unify this, so we can do either two choices. It depends upon we want speed or thoroughness. If you want thoroughness, we'll just have to bite the bullet, get the changes made, and slowly do the march with the other SIGs to get that in place, right? It'll take a long time, but we should expect that.
So let's consider like if we restart the single master kubelet, and is it even possible to only checkpoint the API server?
Yes, you could. You only checkpoint things that are you only checkpoint things that have the annotation. So if it does not have an annotation, it will not be checkpointed.
Yeah, but do we have to? My question was, do we have to add the annotation for all the control plane components, or is only the API server required?
No, you need it for.
If we only checkpoint the API server.
You need it for the other components in order for you to regain the cluster after restart, because the API server won't replicate any pods that were self-hosted, right? So like if you had self-hosted, there will be no rectification, right? Because the whole process of rectification is gone on the uncontrolled restart scenario. So this is, we're doing a ton of work and a ton of thought process on a one user story, which is the single node self-hosted control plane restart scenario.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what, but I was thinking, wouldn't it have state from that a pod? Like, wouldn't it remember that this controller manager pod was running here before?
That's what the checkpoint would do.
Yeah, the API server is stateless. It's not going to remember anything, right?
Yep. The controller manager and the scheduler would have to be checkpointed, which means that if you're going to use component config, that means you got to checkpoint the. Actually, no, you don't need to checkpoint the component config, because as long as it can get the API server, it's fine. And the API server will come back up. So you don't need component config to be checkpointed. It will do this it'll do a loop trying to mount it, but once the API server is back up, it will be able to connect to the API server, and then it will be able to get its component config and then restart eventually.
If we use daemon sets for the controller manager and scheduler, I think technically we don't have to checkpoint the scheduler either, because the controller manager should restart the scheduler.
That is true too.
I'm not sure if that gains us anything though.
No, not really. One less annotation, less stuff on your disk, I guess. But I mean, that's actually nice to think about, because that's less moving parts.
Yeah, but still, I mean, if the API server comes up, it remembers from etcd that this node that I just restarted was running a controller manager. Then the kubelet talks to the API server.
No,
and
the only thing that knows anything is everything has to talk to the API server, and there's separation of responsibilities. So the controller manager will get from the API server state, and then it will rectify the state, right?
Right. So the API server would know that if it asked itself, but it doesn't ask itself.
No, it's stateless. It doesn't know anything.
Right,
it's
so
basically
and says, I'm ready to serve requests. And if somebody says what should be running on the master node, it will tell them, and then somebody can act that change. And that actor is the controller manager.
But I was thinking, like, the kubelet talks to the API server when it comes up. So we have the everything is restarted, nothing is up. Then the kubelet checkpoints or restores the API server, which comes up first as a static pod. Which then talks to etcd and remembers that, hey, I was running a controller manager pod too.
So yeah, you are correct. So it will see that it's bound, right, or that it was bound, right, inside of the etcd.
Yeah, I mean,
they only need to checkpoint the API server, and that's it.
I mean, that could potentially give us some headroom to narrow down the scope anymore, like even more, to say like, well, Kubernetes supports restarting a running API server if it was self-hosted or whatever. And then that's generally useful for everyone.
Everything should recover. That should be a use case. We'd have to test it, but I'm pretty sure you're right. I believe the kubelet will check the bound pods for that environment and then restart those bound pods once it can talk to the API server. And all we need for the API server is checkpointing of secrets and the pod itself.
Yeah.
And config maps if we switch to component config.
Yeah,
well, if the API server switches to component config, that's a big ask.
Yeah, that's gonna take some time for sure. I mean, yeah. So that would yeah. Then we basically only have to think about secrets in the near term, I guess. And
there's other things we need to do too along this road. Like I want to enable we need to enable it in the test suite, right? Like once I get a PR into kubeadm that does the restart, I want to enable it in the test suite and have a test case that basically checks for recovery and restart, like just so we have some coverage there, because right now we don't. And then the next thing that I'd like to put in there too, which is slightly orthogonal but still related, is to feature gate enable priority and preemption, just so we have some coverage there. Because right now we don't actually deploy there's many terms that overlap, but one of the terms was called the rescheduler, and it's not really a rescheduler. So the current rescheduler doesn't reschedule, but whatever's, right?
I think David called it the descheduler.
Yeah, well, there's whatever's critical pod add-ons, right? The critical pod add-on stuff that was done, we don't actually support that, but we should have. So I think that should be a requirement for GA, by the way, is that we have priority preemption enabled, because without that, the control plane components could get killed and then not restarted, right?
Yeah, the reason we don't enable it now is that it's alpha, right?
Yeah, but I was talking with Bobby about this, and he doesn't want to promote it until beta, until we actually get cycles underneath and people are using it. So
so it's this chicken and egg problem. They won't go to beta before we use it, and we necessarily wouldn't like to use it before it's beta. I mean, if it's, well, it's of course hard to say, but if they are confident in the solution and they really think it's like as close to beta as we can get and expect no breaking changes or whatever, then we might do it.
I would love to get test cycles on it, right? I would much prefer to have a means by which we can, enable it as part of the test suite and just get cycles on it to get experience with it and see if we don't hate it and if there's any issues with it. And then over time, if we say like, okay, it went through the entire 110 release process and the test didn't totally flake out on it, we should try it.
So do we have any tests that would, do we have any EDE tests that would actually trigger that condition where it actually would be used? Or do we have to go to density tests or something?
We would have to probably create one. There are some that actually exist for priority preemption. I think we can force the issue. I do believe I reviewed those changes. I do believe we can, but I don't know whether or not they're end-to-end tests. I think we could probably crib what the tests that are there and modify them to do the user story that we care about, which is like we want the API server to not get blown away or killed, or the control plane in general.
We're about to say something, Robert.
Oh, I was going to say is, and I think Tim might have answered my question, but if there are already tests that do this, does flipping the field, the feature gate in kubeadmin and running more EDE tests actually give us any additional coverage? I think the answer is no, unless we write specific tests for the scenario we care about.
Yeah, which would be like API server comes back online, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're still going to get cases where it's just going to loop, right? Like you can still run into a case where your machine just doesn't have enough memory for the API server to work.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. But I think the common cases, I don't know, or either that or we could just completely punt and, well, I don't know. We get into this weird chicken egg problem again, right?
Last time I talked to them, at least, they were hoping that it would hit beta in 110, but yeah, I mean, it seems like there would, at least we would have to start running the tests. So we don't have it in the admission chain right now. We had it for a short period in the 1.9 cycle where we enabled it as we thought it would. Like the plan was for it to hit beta in 1.9, but then we removed it before actually releasing things, starting to release 1.9 stuff. We could do some kind of dance with self-hosting there. If we enable the self-hosting feature gate, we could automatically add the priority thing as well. And then in our self-hosting EDU job, which is actually created by Peter, such a test infra PR, I could link to it later. We could start running those tests, EDU tests as well, at test explicitly the priority and preemption things.
I don't know if, I mean, we can always wait on this. We don't need to blaze the trail, right? If we want to have a policy statement that says like, we'll just wait until it's beta, that's fine too, and let them find the use cases that they care about, right? That's an okay statement to make, because we're probably going to be, there's probably going to be a number of other things that we want to do. And one of the things I want to do this cycle is triage the backlog, because I know I've said that many cycles, but I never had time to. But I actually want to do that, and I'm going to try to commit to it this cycle. So it's okay for us to say that, like, we can just punt on that bit. I think treading back up to the original topic, the checkpointing of secrets, I think I can make a PR for it in this cycle. I don't know if it'll land.
So I guess to bubble up the stack a little bit, we're talking about our plans for self-hosting. Right now, self-hosting is not the default. We are sort of dancing around the discussion of GA. I don't know if we should do that in this meeting or in the wider meeting on Tuesday. But one question is, should self-hosting as default be a blocker for GA, or are we okay sort of going to GA as we are now with self-hosting as an option with maybe some known shortfalls?
I'd rather have self-hosting be a default, because it just makes the upgrade story that much easier to manage over time.
I mean, not on single node. On single node, we have a pretty decent upgrade story right now. And single node is where self-hosting is having a lot of problems design-wise. So if you have a single node master, self-hosted actually may be worse from keeping your cluster running point of view than not self-hosted.
But what does that mean then for, if it's GA, what does that mean then for support? That, like, if you're going to change defaults. So what does it mean to, if we ever change defaults from not self-hosted to self-hosted?
I actually think that would be okay, because from the end user experience, they still have a functioning cluster. And we would just introduce it slowly, right? Like you'd say, you know, for this release, we are switching the default for new clusters, but you can still opt out. We're not going to switch the default for existing clusters during upgrade. I mean, the same thing we were talking about doing when kubeadm was beta, right? I think we can walk that same path once we have higher confidence in self-hosting for single node clusters.
Yeah, so I think that, so what I'm thinking about is like, what does self-hosting gain us when not considering AJ? And that's not much, to be honest. And as we spec out how and if kubeadm should do AJ by itself, I think stay with, like, go to GA with what we have, spec out the AJ story as we go, and the day we're doing kubeadm AJ like out of the box, we should prepare to do the switch to self-hosting by default.
But for a lot of folks, HA is a hard requirement, right? Whether by hook or by crook, HA is just the thing that we have to support for people a lot of folks who are using kubeadm. I know that we have instructions for doing it outside of it, and that might be sufficient, I think, too. So
Yeah.
Like if you don't have self-hosting, then it gets weird, right? The management gets weird.
Yeah, absolutely. So self-hosting is a definite requirement for AJ for kubeadm, but AJ for kubeadm is gonna take time, and as we discussed in Austin, I'd rather go to GA with what we have, and then so that normal people that are fine with one master actually can use it for their boss. Right now we had things like, well, I would love to use kubeadm, but it's beta, so I can't. I'm fine with the features you have. So I think we're absolutely not far from there. I mean, we basically have all the things needed, all the bits needed for going to GA, just a few minor things to fix up and to start incorporate. But otherwise,
I mean, we can also, I mean, like in Kubernetes itself, you've got some features that are GA and some features that are alpha and some features that are beta, and we can break kubeadmin's feature set down and say, these are the things that are GA and are fully supported, and these are the things that aren't. And at least get enough of it to GA where it unblocks, like the set of people Lucas is talking about that, are unable to use it until it's labeled as GA.
As a user, this is what I would expect. I would expect that at some point self-hosting would make it into the tool as an option that I could experiment with. I would also kind of presume that like as people start to experiment with the option, it'll surface other problems in the kubeadm channel that could refine the development of the option.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So yeah,
I wouldn't expect anything to flip over for the use cases that are currently working and that people are depending on in production. Like so, for instance, Kubernetes, like all of its functionality is based around creating single master kubeadm clusters. We've been seeing increased usage. So.
Which is really cool, yeah. I think that is an okay plan. So, I mean, at the really end of this cycle, we flipped back the switch of self-hosting to alpha, not beta, as we had planned, primarily due to that we didn't, as the checkpointing PR was merged so late in the game, I think it was on code freeze day we got the LGTM. Then it didn't make sense, as we wouldn't ship any features that depended on self-hosting being beta anyway. Then we made it alpha for one more release and then have the full 1.10 cycle to test. And then graduate self-hosting, the self-hosting feature of kubeadm to beta while going to GA for the full, like the rest of the package to what we have.
So as long as we're talking about this, can we enumerate the list of things we think should actually block GA?
Let's pull up my doc.
Also, maybe we should solicit feedback too, because we're kind of a microcosm of the universe, right? There's a lot, it's much broader and bigger. Maybe getting feedback from either the list or maybe even devel, maybe both, like the SIG Cluster Lifecycle list and devel list. Be like, hey, we're thinking about going to GA. Here's our list of things that we will block GA for, and here's the list of things that we will be working on, still working towards over time.
Yeah, I mean, we solicited some of that feedback at the Contributor Summit, and people have an enormous laundry list of things they want, but I don't think they're being precise about whether it should block GA or if they're just things they want GA'd in the future, right? Because if we wait for everything that people want, we're never going to get there.
Yep, we'll get there, but just take a long time.
Like 5 years, yeah.
Maybe our CIA will expire by that.
No, I think that's what we should do. Is we should try to enumerate what is sort of the minimal set, and then we should write that up and publish that and say, this is our plan. Here's what we think is going to block. Here's our expected timeline. Like maybe we can make it in 110, or maybe we think it'll slip to 111. And then we should publicize that in our SIG and then also on the dev list, and see if anybody has strong pushback.
Yeah, so that's basically what I'm trying to do with my roadmap doc. I mean, it's super rough right now. I literally just typed things like when flying back to Europe, typing things on the airplane, and until my laptop ran out of battery, basically. And yeah, I think the feedback that you said, graduate kubeadm phase, for example, it's top level and beta, doesn't block, but I think it's a reasonable thing to do. I mean, we've had it for 2-3 releases by then.
Sure, but I mean, if you're saying it's going to be beta, then that should not block our GA, right? I guess that's what I'm trying. I'm trying to like be precise about really trimming the list down and making sure that if we have to drop things, we drop things that don't block GA.
Yeah.
So I pasted your list into the meeting notes for this group. If people have that up, and I'll read through them. So the first one is self-hosting with certificates mounted using host path to beta. So it comes back to whether self-hosting should be a blocker, which I think I was just arguing that it shouldn't, which means that we should take this off as well. Again, we should try to do it, but it shouldn't block GA. Yes, no? Thoughts?
I think it makes sense to split. So yeah, what I have there is basically what I hope we'll achieve in 110. And it makes total sense to split that between what's needed for GA and what's nice to have in 110. I think the self-hosting bit, it's hard. I would really like to have it to say that here is kubeadm, a GA tool that has beta, that has 2 options. One of which is static pod hosting, which is GA, fully GA, and it's the default. And one is self-hosting, which is also proven to work, has test cycles behind it, but it's on beta level. We expect to graduate it to GA later. I really would like that, but yeah.
Yeah, if I had to pick one, I would pick getting what we have to GA and self-hosting left in alpha for a release cycle. I mean, if we had to really pare it down.
Fair enough. I guess that's.
Yeah. So I split in the meeting notes into 2 sections. So we've got blocking GA and what's nice to have in 110. So self-hosting with certificates mounted using a host path to beta, I put nice to have. Graduate kubeadmin phase and CorDNS by default, I put those as nice to have also. So the things that are left, we have dynamic kubelet configuration to beta. Do we think that should block GA?
Yes, that has to block GA, as it radically changes the way we package kubeadm and also do upgrades.
Okay, so we got to poke Toffin to try to get that in right away.
Yeah,
it's been a while.
Well, I was all in, but they just didn't switch the knob.
Yeah.
Beta.
So no, it actually, they found the code freeze day, they found a bug.
Yeah, I think something got rolled back, right?
Yeah. Something with flag or config precedence or something. I don't know.
All right. Number 2 is dynamic kubelet configuration certs to beta.
Serving such, yeah.
Should that block GA? Can you explain what that is for people? When I read that, it could mean multiple things.
Yeah, so that is basically, right now, the kubelet starts up. It takes the bootstrap kube config from disk that kubeadm has generated for it. It sends a CSR. generates a private key locally. It sends a CSR with the public key to the server, and it gets that certificate signed, returns it, and has now a unique identity to use. But it totally, and with the right cluster CA, but it totally self-signs everything that it uses for the kubelet API server, which makes, when you do kubectl logs and kubectl exec, the API server talks to the kubelet API server. And that communication is insecure. It's using HTTPS, yes, but the API server have no way to trust the kubelet. So I guess it's a matter of taste whether we are fine with that. I mean, virtually everyone else seems to be fine with that, as everybody's doing it. But it would. So I talked to Jordan and Mike during the Dev Summit, and we came up with a plan that the kubelet would post its node objects. The API server would recognize the IPs and host names it reports as like something like unverified or whatever, self-reported or whatever. Then, depending on whether you're running, that would happen in any case, depending on whether you're running in a cloud or with a central list of what nodes to trust, or in a bare metal environment where you might not have such a table, you would have different policies. So the default for kubeadm would be trust the self-reported IPs. And then for cloud environments, the cloud controller manager would kick in and say, okay, this node's IP address is verified. Then basically, if you are okay with, okay, let's do the so if you're okay with the kubelet reporting its own addresses, the CSR signer will go ahead and sign the serving cert for the kubelet, and the kubelet's API server will have the same cluster CA as everything else. So then we have one uniform CA all around. And can, from the master side, trust this kubelet when talking. That is basically the thing. The extra security feature, which we'll gain as well, is the ability to restrict these IPs to trust by using a cloud environment. That will not be the default, but it would be an extra integration that the controller manager would, or the cloud control manager would do. But in the general case of kubeadm is that we can actually have secure communication all around in the cluster, instead of having all kubelets using different certificates.
Okay, I thought we'd already done this. I remember CJ doing something along these lines for GKE, and I found an issue that I linked in the notes where Jordan said that we had done it in kubeadmin as well. Maybe that's not actually true.
That's another thing. That is when a person calls the kubelet API, the default in 1.5 was that allow all. So if I had a 1.5 kubelet, I could just curl and exec into any pod of that kubelet, basically, or get logs from any pod in the kubelet with no authorization or anything. What the kubelet is doing now is that okay, I received a call. I'm posting a subject access review request to the API server, which then returns, is this identity authorized to access the kubelet?
Okay, so that's about client authentication and not about server-side authentication. I assumed that issue had covered both when they said that we'd fixed it, because if you only have one half of the authentication story, it doesn't really secure the communications, right? You can still man the middle of the connection really easily.
Yeah, exactly. So the problem right now is when the API server calls to the kubelet, it's basically pretty trivial to man in the middle the network traffic between the API server and the kubelet. And you can give the API, you can pretend to be a pod or whatever. And then the user will type in whatever when kubectl executing, and you can do what you like or something like that. So yeah, it would be an extra security feature for sure. And it's basically I hope this thing, I mean, the code is not trivial, of course, it's security, but it's not that hard to code-wise implement, as we now spec'd out a plan to do it. From what I understand, the person that has been responsible for this at Google left or something like that. So we have to find a new owner, which could be Jordan, from what my interpretation was when we talked. But officially, nobody has signed up yet. I would like to list it as a blocker for GA preliminarily, and then see.
I don't want to throw Moyer under a bus because he's not here, but we might be able to throw him under a bus for that one.
We could ask. That is also a potential good person to do it.
Okay. Next is Bootstrap tokens to GA.
So that is, I don't know. I mean, the only thing that we know of is that we have the public config map. It's not rate limited. The API server has a throttling, some kind of throttling functionality. So it can only handle n amount of requests per second. That means if you're a hacker, you could easily go ahead and issue tens of thousands of requests to this config map, and it will essentially drain that limit per second. So your cluster might get 10 requests per second at max, because the API server is busy like just showing the config map to a hacker. So it's not a security exposure or whatever, but it's basically a DOS vector.
Yeah, but there's a million ways to DOS the cluster, right? Like you can DOS the cluster just by running enough workloads of type N. So I don't know if that is the limiter, right?
This is a DOS vector for someone who doesn't have client creds, though, right?
Yeah.
If you just have the IP or name of the cluster endpoint, you can DOS it, which is worse than somebody who's authorized to launch a job being able to DOS the cluster. I mean, you can mitigate it by putting your cluster IP behind a firewall. Is the other answer?
Which is what everyone should do, but
yeah, but well, I don't know. So what Joe said spontaneously was something like, let's restrict this to a certain IP range that was considered internal. I don't know if he was thinking about all the reserved subnets for internal network communication, but I think he was. And do some rate limiting on everything else. But I don't know.
Doesn't all of Bootstrap tokens run on the internal network, or does it run on the external IP, right?
I could provision a DigitalOcean VM with a public IP and run kubeadm join from a Raspberry Pi. So
okay,
we can't assume that, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, GKE for a long time just stuck your cluster on the internet. You can now add firewall rules to lock it down, but that's relatively recent. So That's why I was saying please don't let people DOS, because that was gonna hurt us.
So yeah, that's the only reason we're in beta, not GA, for that feature.
Okay, it's 9:45. Let's keep moving. Next is TLS secure the localhost endpoint, and this is TLS secure the etcd localhost endpoint.
Yeah.
That we turned off a little bit.
Absolutely. I missed the word. Yeah. So basically, everyone that is on the master, regardless of user, has root access to your master. So that means if I run as an unprivileged user on the master that I'm running on, like nobody or whatever, that has no normal privileges, I could just hit the etcd endpoint and schedule my pod. So do we want to scope this down by just generating, setting etcd up with some straightforward certificates? Maybe even just sign for local hosts, maybe the public IP as well, and then store these certs where we store all the other certs which are owned by root. Then that would mitigate the issue, and would also preserve some forwards, would make it easier to interact with a potential AJ cluster in the future where there's a total requirement to use certificates.
Yeah, this one seems like it might be a good starter project for someone who wants to write some kubeadmin code, because we already have code that generates certs and code that shuffles things around on disk, and it's essentially just plumbing a couple flags into etcd and the API server.
Yeah, it's straightforward to implement in that sense that you have to generate 2 or 3 certs, maybe 4, I don't know yet, and then just add these arguments to the etcd static pod. So, and in the upgrade case, just run, when upgrading from 1.9 to 1.10, just generate the certs and you'll be fine. So, in beforehand. I think I have people or folks that could do that. Lee, do you want to help?
I would be interested in looking at what's needed to make that happen.
Perfect. Then I'll write up an issue. I don't know if are you in the Kubernetes organization?
No.
Okay, then I can't assign you, but feel free to morally investigate what's what's needed. Yeah, I have 20 issues to write down still.
Sorry, so just to reiterate, basically we want to take some of the certs that are generated from kubeadm and add them onto the etcd static pod, so that when we talk to it locally, it's wrapped in TLS. Right?
Yeah, so we generate a couple of new certificates by default, some etcd specific. We will still have to choose whether we could take that offline, I guess, whether we should use a dedicated etcd CA or if we should use the Kubernetes CA. That is an interesting discussion to have, I guess. But let's start with using the Kubernetes CA for simplicity, and then maybe change during the cycle. So basically just generate a serving cert for etcd and a peer cert, and add the flags and whatever host path mounts to etcd. We would still listen on localhost as we do right now. And then make the API server talk to etcd using its own. It needs a client credential then.
Yeah, and so we'd have to generate that as well.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right, next you had enable advanced auditing question mark.
It was
like a nice to have.
Yeah, I don't know. I was just thinking, like, what does it take right now? I mean, is it something that we consider a normal Kubernetes cluster to have? Or is it something that is actually really specific to whatever users needs?
I think a lot of people won't care for smaller clusters, but a lot of people will absolutely care for larger environments because they will want to enable audit logging and to have all the jiggery there. So I think option enabling it and having it a nice to have would be a nice to have, but I don't think it's strictly required for the primary user story for kubeadm.
Sounds very reasonable to me. Let's put that on the nice to haves.
Awesome. And the last one you had, Lucas, was make kubeadmin kubelet drop in generic, not minor version specific.
Yeah, that is a consequence of using dynamic kubelet configuration, basically. So when we have dynamic kubelet configuration, we can stop putting all the kubelet arguments in the kubelet drop-in file in the kubeadm dev package, which right now is not optimal. So, I mean, and that means we don't have to do some ugly hacks when upgrading that we have to do right now.
But we'll have to push any new features, we'll have to push through the API server for the component config for the kubelet. But that's less ugly than the ugly hacks for our swappings.
So what I'm thinking, so when we upgrade our cluster to 1.11 or whatever, kubeadm would write the desired kubelet configuration into a config map that is version specific. Then when you upgrade your kubelet, we could do some kind of helper command to like redirect the configuration to use the 1.11 thing or whatever. So the current node upgrading story is basically apt-get upgrade. That will stop the kubelet service. It will download the new binary. It will restart the service for you. Then, as we have no running daemon inside of kubeadm clusters, we have no way to actually. So on the node object, there's a config map reference, basically pointing to the desired configuration. So we have no way to actually repoint this to the 1.11 config map, which we recently generated. So we probably have to say to the user, run this kubectl command, like do apt-get upgrade, run this kubectl command, or run this apt-get upgrade and do kubeadm upgrade, kubelet repoint configuration, or whatever wrapper command we might add. But there's one extra step we have to do there. If we want to get fancy sometime in the future, we could always do some kind of job that like schedules on one node, goes and execs out to host namespace, goes and runs whatever package manager thing you have, then updates this reference, goes to the next node, etc. But as we discussed early in the summer as well, but that is not a high priority thing, I think. Most people are fine with running 2 commands, like in the getting start new Kubernetes user, well, I upgraded my cluster. I have to run 2 commands per node to upgrade them as well when I'm ready. And in the automated case, that wouldn't be a problem either. So yeah, I think it should be okay.
Okay, so that was sort of Lucas's list of things he thought should block GA. Do other people have things we want to add to the list before we write this up in sort of a more formal form? I mean, we can always consider adding things later, but it'd be nice to be able to discuss them in this forum first, if people know offhand what they'd like to put in.
I think we should just clause it with like, these other features that we know we plan to address, but we will iterate on them over time, and they will eventually come to GA. But the major feature set, this is the major feature set that we're looking for GA.
That is a good point. And on those features, we would have an example of self-hosting, right?
Yes.
Other features
possibly the kubeadmin phase stuff, things like that we have in the nice to have list, or that are otherwise alpha or beta today.
Yeah.
Sorry. What about the Kubernetes, the kubeadmin API or the definition for the kubeadmin master configuration file? Now it is alpha.
That is going to be alpha for a long time. I've given up. We're basically waiting for component config. Yeah. Now in 1.9 we have started to use kubelet's component config and kubeproxy's component config, both in alpha. But anyway, that is reasonable, I guess, and we'll just wait for all these component configs to hit beta. We'll wait for the API server and controller manager to actually start creating a group, moving it out to a separate API group, and then render everything in as beta. Then we can consolidate and unify with the cluster API, and finally we can graduate it to beta and beyond.
Yeah, I think a lot of the stuff that we would put in there, we want to let other component owners drive via component config. There's still going to be a decent amount of kubeadmin specific stuff, like things like certificates and how you manage those inside of your cluster, that we'll still want to have in there. But I'm hoping that the list shrinks rather drastically via the component config effort.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, we have 2 minutes left. We have a nice to have list for 1.10. We've discussed a lot of the things we think would block GA. If anyone wants to volunteer to sort of write that up into a sort of summary document with, nice bullets and formatting and rationale that we can send out for sort of wider consensus, that'd be awesome. Otherwise, we can work on that next week.
So, do you think we could use the general SIG Cluster Lifecycle roadmap of the next year to have a section? This is what we think kubeadm is going to need to go GA, and we're targeting GA for 1.10.
I think it'd be nice to have Tim, you were going to say something. I think it'd be nice to have just a specific doc for kubeadmin GA, and we can link to that from the roadmap and say one of the things in 2018 is kubeadmin is a GA, and just link to the other doc. Because then we can circulate just the shorter thing around and get people to read that.
We can't hear you.
I'm going to be out till next, starting Saturday, I'm going to be out till the end of the year. So I don't want to commit to writing it up because I have to do some closeout stuff on my side this week to make sure everyone else can free run for a while. So I don't have cycles really right now.
I guess that begs a good question of which ones of these meetings do we want to cancel for the holidays if people know they're not going to be around. So
that's a good question.
There's the 27th when I definitely won't be there.
Me neither.
January 3rd.
So this is when it's
So will people be around next week?
Maybe.
Lucas is a maybe.
How about others?
I'm a no.
You guys can thumbs up or put something in chat if you don't want to speak.
I'm fine with canceling and then taking things, like for those who are in office or otherwise available, I'm fine with like directing people from the SIG channel to the various resources.
Okay, so I'd propose we cancel this meeting both next week and the following week, so the 20th and the 27th, and we'll reconvene on the 3rd. I had something in the agenda yesterday we didn't get to, is whether we should change this to an office hours. And I think we should talk about that in the new year also. Yeah,
and also probably in the normal SIG meeting to have wider consensus on whether that's a good idea or not. So my plan is basically, I have a contract still with Weave until end of year. Then I've said that I'm not taking any other contracts until I have all my exams finished, which is like early April or whatever. But I'm focusing all my time now in December to produce this kind of GA documentation, filing all the issues I can think of, so I can just like shoot them around on people and see if they are willing to help fix issues, and then try to see what, like, documentation and such things, and the general SIG mission to be, and then occasionally like jump on these meetings and serve as a tech lead and help out, but not in a commitment sense that I've, like, for example, coordinating a release won't be a thing.
All right. Well, we'll have to do a yeoman's job to cover what you've been working on. But we are a couple of minutes over, so I think I'm going to call it here. Thanks, everyone, for coming. We'll talk to you next week at the regular SIG meeting, or in an hour at the Cluster API breakout, or in 3 weeks again at the next one of these. Have a good day.
Cool. Bye.